Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Thursday, October 4th.
Laquan McDonald was never going to walk home that night. The defendant decided that on the way to the scene.
This case is a tragedy, there's no question, but it's not a murder.
With closing arguments complete, the jury begins its deliberations in the murder trial of police officer Jason Van Dyke. A prominent Black Lives Matter activist and his new memoir. Organic gardener Gene Nolan returns to the Chicago Tonight Garden for summer's last hurrah.
Congratulations on your deal in Denver, Dave. I'm putting you down to deal with Dallas. Don, is it a deal? Do we have a deal?
From TV commercials to a legendary Southside Art Center, a new 4-part series on art and design in Chicago.
I paid my debts to society, even Steven.
And Hetty Weiss reviews a provocative new play about sex offenders at Steppenwolf Theater, plus the Tootsie musical and more. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. The city is now waiting for a verdict in the Jason Van Dyke murder trial. Brandis Friedman has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Brandis.
And Phil, city officials are preparing for the verdict in the case of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. The Chicago Police Department says it's adding an extra 4,000 officers on the streets, as well as putting officers on 12-hour shifts and canceling days off. Superintendent Eddie Johnson tells the Chicago Sun-Times that this plan is necessary because no matter the verdict, he expects some unhappy people. Our reporter Matt Masterson has been in the courtroom. He'll have much more on what happened in just a few minutes. And Chicago police have released surveillance video of the person they say may be responsible for 2 recent murders in Rogers Park. So these clips show a man walking in the 1400 block of West Sherwin Avenue Sunday morning around 11:11. That's minutes before a 73-year-old man was shot to death while walking his dog in the same area. Police say ballistics show the same gun was used to murder a 24-year-old man whose body was found the next day near a park, also in Rogers Park. Police say witnesses described the suspect as a male, thin-build, wearing dark clothing and a ski mask. More than 3,500 city employees have a new deal with the city of Chicago. AFSCME Local 31 says it had been in negotiations with the city for more than a year, but finally reached an agreement that union members ratified last night. The union covers employees in health clinics, libraries, and police stations, among other places. An AFSCME representative says the 5-year deal provides family-sustaining wages and access to affordable health care. Mayor Rahm Emanuel says the agreement will help the city control health care costs and ensure fiscal stability. The city council still has to approve the contract. And even the name Trunk has been trunked. After just 2 years, the parent company of the Chicago Tribune is changing its name back to Tribune Publishing. The company, which owns 9 other publications, including the Baltimore Sun and the New York Daily News, made the announcement this afternoon. It goes into effect next week. The name Trunk, which stood for Tribune Online Content, was introduced by major shareholder and former chairman Michael Farrow, but it was much ridiculed. The MacArthur Foundation has named its newest class of geniuses. One Illinoisan makes the class of 25 newly minted Genius Grant Fellows. Rebecca Sandifer is a professor of both sociology and law at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work involves promoting a new evidence-based approach to increasing access to civil justice for low-income communities.
It's pretty clear if you look at one of the major forces that creates inequality in our society. One of them is the ways in which people are able or not able to get a lawful resolution to their justice problems. Every group in society has them. So if you can find better ways to solve them or manage them, it actually benefits everybody in society directly.
Other Genius Grant recipients from around the country come from a variety of disciplines, including an epidemiologist and global health advocate, a playwright, a neuroscientist, and social justice advocate. As for the weather tonight, partly cloudy with a chance of storms and a low around 51 degrees. Then tomorrow, showers likely with a high near 63. And don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook or YouTube via podcast and a PBS video app, as well as online at WTTW.com/news. Now, Phil, back to you.
Thank you, Brandis. The jurors deliberating the fate of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke are sequestered tonight after about 5 hours of deliberations. Judge Vincent Gahn also dismissed 2 of the alternate jurors late this afternoon. In interviews with reporters after their dismissal, that is, both of those jurors said they would have voted to convict Van Dyke of the murder of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. Van Dyke is facing 19 counts, including first-degree murder for fatally shooting McDonald 16 times. Before the case went to the jury this afternoon, both sides delivered closing arguments. In her argument, Special Prosecutor Jody Gleason said that police officer Jason Van Dyke decided to shoot Laquan McDonald before he even saw him.
Laquan McDonald was never going to walk home that night. The defendant decided that on the way to the scene. You heard what it was that he said. I guess we'll have to shoot him. It wasn't the knife in Laquan's hand that made the defendant kill him that night. It was his indifference to the value of Laquan's life.
Here now to tell us more about what happened in court today is Chicago Tonight's Matt Masterson, who has been in the courtroom throughout the trial. Matt, we just heard a snippet of the prosecutor's closing argument. How compelling overall was the totality of the argument?
Well, they relied on the most compelling evidence that they had, which was the dash cam video of the shooting, as well as autopsy photos showing each of the wounds on Laquan McDonald's body. But prosecutors also repeatedly told jurors that the defense had exaggerated the risk that McDonald actually posed to officers on the scene that night. They pointed to another officer on the scene, Joseph McGilligan, who pursued McDonald for a few blocks on foot and said he never felt threatened enough to pull the trigger and shoot McDonald. There was another truck driver on the scene as well, the person who first called 911, Rudy Barillas, who also, he was actually attacked by McDonald, but he was able to defend himself using some gravel on his phone to throw at him. And the prosecutors basically said that once it got down to Van Dyke, he didn't try to do any other options. He went right towards deadly force, and that's why he should be convicted, because he avoided all their options. Matt,
another point that the prosecutor made had to do with the Van Dyke's statements afterwards. Gleason argued that Van Dyke fabricated his account of the incident in order to justify killing McDonald.
He told Detective March, the detective who was on the scene that night, that when McDonald was within 10 to 15 feet of him, McDonald looked at him and raised the knife across his chest, over his shoulder, pointing the knife at him. He also told the detective that in defense of his life, he backpedaled and fired a handgun at McDonald to stop the attack. He told him that he continued to fire the weapon at McDonald as McDonald was on the ground and McDonald appeared to be attempting to get up. None of that happened. You've seen the videos. He made it up to justify the use of deadly force.
Any reaction from Van Dyke or the jurors? Any visible reaction as the prosecutor was making her closing arguments?
Not so much at the time. The jurors have been relatively muted when they're hearing arguments. Van Dyke himself is also usually pretty restrained when he's in court. But after the day ended, when these 2 alternate jurors were dismissed, they were allowed to speak with the media, and they gave a little more insight into what their thinking was on the case, which is the first that anyone has really heard on this. They both said that they would vote to convict Van Dyke. They clearly bought into the prosecutor's arguments that Van Dyke acted too quickly. They said he could have waited for a taser to arrive on the scene. A squad car with a taser arrived within 30 seconds after the shooting. They also felt that McDonald's actions before the shooting didn't matter because Van Dyke didn't know about them. He knew very little, and they kind of boiled things down to just what that very small interaction was right before the shooting started.
We've been focusing on the prosecutor's closing argument, but in his closing statement, Van Dyke's lead defense counsel, Dan Herbert, argued that the outcome on that night could have been very different but for the actions of Laquan McDonald.
This case is a tragedy. There's no question. But it's not a murder. It's a tragedy, but not a murder. And it's a tragedy that could have been prevented with one simple step. At any point throughout that 20-some minute rampage, had Laquan McDonald dropped that knife, he'd be here today.
Again, that was just a snippet of the defense attorney's closing argument. Looking at the totality of his closing argument, what was the theme that he was trying to establish?
They had a compelling argument as well. As Dan Herbert said there, he called the whole situation a tragedy, but he said it was one of McDonald's own making, that it was McDonald who could have prevented the shooting by just dropping the knife, and it wasn't Van Dyke's fault that he was put in the position to defend himself. Dan Herbert also talked about how the dash cam video, which jurors saw over and over again throughout the trial, wasn't the good evidence that prosecutors made it out to be. They said it didn't show Van Dyke's perspective of things during the shooting, and he said that's not enough to convict his client. He asked jurors not to look at this through the lens of a camera, but through the lens of Van Dyke himself, and put themselves in his shoes during the shooting, which the defense also tried to do in the situation with an animated recreation of the shooting.
And as you know, first-degree murder charges against a police officer are few and far between, and that's one of the things that Van Dyke's defense attorney said, that charges against a police officer of first-degree murder are virtually unprecedented.
First-degree murder. That's the charges here. First-degree murder. It's unprecedented. It's unprecedented for a police officer who responds to a scene, is called to a scene, comes upon an individual with a knife acting in this strange manner. First-degree murder? No motive, no malice, no premeditation? Well, the state said, well, you'll see the instructions. You don't have to have that. Well, you can use your common sense, ladies and gentlemen, and you can determine what is a murder. This isn't.
Matt, you were there for the entire trial. What was he driving at there?
Well, it is quite unprecedented for a Chicago police officer to be charged with the most serious crime that someone can be charged with in Illinois, first-degree murder. This is the first time in years, decades even, that a Chicago police officer has been charged with murder stemming from an on-duty shooting. It just doesn't happen very often. Herbert's point there was about how the state use of force statutes that are taught to Chicago police recruits and officers really back up officers, and that they typically don't find themselves in this situation when there is a shooting.
And as you know, in a criminal case, when you come to the part of closing arguments, the prosecution states its case and the defense, and then the prosecution typically issues a rebuttal. And in the rebuttal, Special Prosecutor Joseph McMahon said that Officer Van Dyke had many other options besides deadly force.
Jason Van Dyke chose to ignore all of his other options. He made the decision to use deadly force. He had the option of clicking on that radio that's attached to his shirt collar to find out where the status and where that taser was. He had the option to just wait for that taser and let them use the taser on Laquan. And of course, he had the option of time. Gaffney and McElligott, they gave him nearly 10 minutes of time and consideration and assessment. Jason Van Dyke gave him 6 seconds.
These things are impossible to predict, of course, but any sense about how long the jury might deliberate?
Well, they're going to get back at it tomorrow morning. They're done for today. They're back at 8:30 in the morning. So the 12 remaining jurors and 3 alternates have been sequestered for the night until a verdict has been reached, actually, not just tonight if they go into the weekend. But it sounds like they still have some ground to cover. They requested a transcript of the testimony from Van Dyke's partner, Joseph Walsh, at the end of the day today. And some of the jurors have said they've had some trouble concentrating given the long hours that they've been putting in. So it's possible that they take things a little bit slower tomorrow and act a little more deliberate in their deliberations throughout the day. So it's unclear at this point if they're going to go into the weekend, but I think a lot of that will have to do with how much ground they cover tomorrow.
Matt, thank you. And now to Eddie Aruza and the decisions facing the jury in this case. Eddie.
Phil, as Matt reported, the jurors have some work to do in deciding the fate of Officer Jason Van Dyke as they weigh the 19 charges against him. And here is what those charges are: murder with the intent to kill or injure with a firearm, murder with a strong probability to kill or injure with a firearm, 16 counts of aggravated battery for discharging his firearm 16 times, and 1 count of official misconduct for knowing that he was forbidden by law to shoot and kill Laquan McDonald without lawful justification. And as we reported just before they began deliberations, Judge Vaughn gave the jurors the option of considering second-degree murder against Officer Van Dyke. And joining us tonight to break down the charges, the closing arguments, and the evidence that was presented are Richard Kling, a clinical professor of law at the IIT Chicago-Kent College of Law and a defense attorney. Before teaching, Professor Kling served at the Cook County Public Defender's Office from 1976 to 1981, where he tried hundreds of murder cases, including 28 capital cases. And Sharon Mitchell, Deputy Director of the Illinois Justice Project. Previously, Mr. Mitchell served as a trial attorney in the Cook County Public Defender's Office from 2009 to 2016. Thank you both for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Professor Kling, what do you make of that comment made by those 2 alternate jurors that were dismissed, that they had already made up their minds to convict Jason Van Dyke? Do you think that other jurors have already reached that conclusion?
I've seen alternates talk to and jurors come to completely opposite decisions. On the other hand, if I were Jason Van Dyke, based on their discussions, I'd be concerned.
What was your overall read of this jury?
I think the biggest problem is the videotape. I think realistically there is a videotape showing Jason Van Dyke shooting. There's a videotape showing Laquan McDonald falling to the ground. There is no videotape, contrary to the defense contention, showing Laquan McDonald lifting his hand with a knife in his hand and in the direction of the police officer. I think that's the biggest impediment to Jason being found not guilty.
And you think that that probably made the biggest impact on this jury?
I think that, and then there was also the animation, which didn't help his case at all. The animation which he requested doesn't show him picking his arm up, and I know the defense position is that, well, it showed it from a different perspective. I could look at you from the front, from the back, from the side, or upside down, and either your arm's above your shoulder or at your shoulder, or it's not.
Sharon Mitchell, we heard just snippets of the closing arguments just moments ago, but you heard them in their entirety. Give me your reaction. Was one side stronger in their arguments than the other?
Well, certainly there was a lot more passion on the defense side, but it's no wonder they certainly have a little bit more difficult of a climb to get to where they need to get to. The prosecutors in this case, like you would normally see, were very reserved. They kind of dispassionately explained what the law was and explained their theory of the case. The defense was a little bit more animated and really was more aggressive.
As the defense attorney, Mr. Herbert, pointed out, he said that this is unprecedented that a police officer is charged with murder. I'm not sure that if that's true. You'd have to go back many decades in Chicago to find that. But is it unusual that Van Dyke is charged with 2 different counts of murder?
Well, no. Typically what will happen is that a prosecutor will charge a number of different ways of the same act, and then once we get down to the actual trial, they'll kind of narrow down what they're actually going to go for in the trial.
So Richard Kling, let's try to define what all of these different charges, including second-degree murder, mean. So there's murder with intent to kill or injure, and murder with a strong probability to kill or injure, and second-degree murder. Give us the difference between all those 3.
Okay. The first one is both alternative theories are first-degree murder. First-degree murder, if he's convicted, is a mandatory minimum of 20 years in the penitentiary, plus if they find that he discharged the weapon, it's a mandatory consecutive sentence of 25, so he is facing a mandatory minimum at 100% of 45 years if he goes down on first-degree murder. Second-degree murder is first-degree murder plus a mitigating factor. Popular misconception that it's a lesser included offense of first-degree murder. In order to be found guilty of second-degree murder, you have to be found guilty of first-degree murder, and then the defendant has an obligation to show that this mitigating factor existed. What's the mitigating factor? I had a right to use self-defense, but I may have been excessive or used too much self-defense. If he's convicted of second-degree murder, he's facing 4 to 20 in the penitentiary, but it's also probationable. Another big problem for him is he's got 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. Each count is mandatory 6 to 30 in the penitentiary, and under the statute, each count must run consecutively. So if he's found guilty of 16 counts of aggravated battery, he's facing 16 times 6 plus whatever he would have for the murder. It's a very serious amount of time he's facing.
Sharon Mitchell, in the prosecution's closing, they argued that there were 10 officers on the scene, but only Jason Van Dyke fired his weapon. So there were 10 officers that they said didn't shoot Laquan McDonald. Was that an effective message?
I think it's one of the most effective arguments they have. There was the fact that there were lots of officers there, all of them there longer than Jason Van Dyke, and none of them making the decision that Jason Van Dyke made. It's one of the strongest arguments they had, and they really tried to hit it home, especially in the rebuttal close.
Give me your reaction to that video animation that Professor Kling said did not help Jason Van Dyke's case. What did you think of it?
It was quite disastrous, especially when Jason Van Dyke got on the stand and said himself that that did not come from his perspective as he was being cross-examined, and the fact that it did not show that his arm was raised really undercut the defense's case.
But the defense saw it, and they knew that, and they went with it anyway. So what did you think the impact was supposed to be on the jury?
Well, what they wanted to do was show distance. What was key was the fact that they argued that he was getting closer, and they really wanted to hit home the fact that he was in an area in which he could do damage to Officer Van Dyke. So it was really about distance, but it did not turn out very well for the defense.
Richard Kling, what do you believe was the most powerful moment in Mr. Van Dyke's testimony?
The most powerful moment in Van Dyke's testimony, I think, was more the cross. I don't think it was very powerful. I think realistically it could have been much more powerful. I would have, if it were my case, I would have taken him through, what did you think of when you got up in the morning? I thought, am I going to see my wife again when I come home tonight? I think he could have been personalized more. If he's believed, then it's not guilty. If he's not believed, then it's guilty.
And he did contradict himself more than once. So give me your reaction to that.
I think the contradictions hurt. I think they fought to get in the animation, and then when he was on the stand with the animation, he himself said, well, that doesn't show it from my perspective, which was sort of inconsistent with their whole argument in getting it in.
Sharon Mitchell, did he prove self-defense at all, or did he have any realistic claims to self-defense while he was on the stand?
Well, he certainly tried to focus on the fact that he only saw the knife and that he was so concerned with the knife, and that's all that he was thinking about. It was certainly not the most convincing testimony, but he was dealt not that great of a hand. That facts are the facts, and he had no choice but to say that he forgot or that he was in shock. But I don't know if it was the best testimony I've seen.
As we heard Matt report, the jury has requested some transcripts, so they are deliberating with caution, it seems like. But is there a lot of pressure on this jury because they have to know that this is being closely watched and it could be a transformational moment for this city? What do you think?
I mean, who knows with juries? You would think that they know the stakes, but we just don't know. I think it might not be right for us to speculate whether there is undue pressure on them.
And one thing they don't know is, even though they've been given the opportunity to decide second-degree murder, is that they don't know what the penalties are for any of these charges, do they?
They don't know what the penalties are for any of it. They do know, however, it's a police officer who's probably going to go away. I agree with Mr. Herbert. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for Laquan McDonald. It's a tragedy for Officer Van Dyke. One way or the other, there's no winners in this case.
But of course, as the defense is closing this, all that they need, or maybe that they're hoping for, is one juror to have enough doubt to not convict or not bring any charges. Do you think that would happen across the board here?
One juror is a hung juror across all four of the counts?
Yes, across all the counts.
I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. I know there's a police officer, somebody who was accepted by the academy who's on the jury. I don't think it's impossible for it to be hung.
And Sharon, as you heard also reported that the police department is gearing up for whatever the reaction might be. 4,000 more officers on the street, 12-hour shifts, vacations have been canceled. Do you think realistically that this city is going to erupt in violence or flames if the jury doesn't come back with some sort of conviction that pleases some of the communities?
Well, obviously no one can say for sure, but I do think that we've seen the city go through a lot, whether it was the release of the actual video, whether it was the shooting on 71st Street. The city has demonstrated that they can protest and do it in a safe manner. It is a shame to see that many of the predictions of riots come from individuals that are outside of the community that may not have a great understanding of the community's belief and understanding of the criminal justice system. So I would not be predicting riots. I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest that.
Professor Kling, again, you've been at this quite a long time, and you say that you're not in the prediction business. But how soon do you think we might be getting a verdict, especially since this is really a 3-day weekend coming up, isn't it?
I think it's not a tremendously complicated case. There are some charges, but there's not a multitude of charges. They've got the video, and they've got a 3-day weekend coming up, and jurors who are already locked up do not like to get locked up over weekends. So I would think it's going to be tomorrow.
And of course, the courts are closed on Monday, but Judge Vaughn could decide that they will deliberate, or decide that they won't.
Judge Gawne.
Excuse me, Judge
Yes.
Gawne. Yes.
No, he could. He could have them down on Saturday if he wants. I've had juries down on Saturdays and Sundays. He could do whatever he wants to do.
And maybe even on Columbus Day?
And maybe even on Columbus Day.
All right. Richard Kling and Sharon Mitchell, thank you very much for your insights tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
There's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, what to do in the garden as the season changes. Organic gardener Gene Nolan has some tips. From TV commercials to a legendary Southside Art Center, a new 4-part series on Chicago art and design. And Hetty Weiss reviews new shows at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, Steppenwolf and the Goodman, and more. But first, Baltimore native activist DeRay McKesson has emerged as a prominent voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2014, McKesson left his Minneapolis apartment and traveled to Ferguson, Missouri to join protests following the fatal shooting of teenager Michael Brown by a police officer. It wasn't long before he left his job as an administrator at Minneapolis Public Schools to devote himself to organizing and activism. He has written a book called On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. It serves as both a personal memoir and a guide to activism. And DeRay McKesson joins us now. He also hosts the weekly political podcast, Pod Save the People. DeRay, good to meet you. And as I mentioned, in 2014, you had this middle-of-the-night realization that caused you to go directly to Ferguson. What was that realization?
Yeah, it's good to be here. And, you know, in 2014, up until then, I'd worked in schools. I taught 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn. I worked in Baltimore City Public Schools. I worked in Minneapolis Public Schools. And I always talked about this commitment to kids. I lived this commitment to kids. And when I saw that Mike Brown Jr. had been killed, it was like they killed a teenager. That I spent so much of my energy trying to make sure that teachers had that kids had good teachers, but like that doesn't matter if you get killed by the police. So I wanted to go down at the very least and go see for myself. The second night I was in St. Louis was the first night that I was tear gassed, and I was like, nobody should have to experience a world like this. So I'll do whatever I can, and that was the beginning for me.
You wear this blue Patagonia vest. You've worn it since your days at Ferguson. Why do you wear it?
Yeah, you know, it is. I never thought the vest would be a thing for other people, but it keeps me grounded. It reminds me that everything we went through was real. I've been wearing it for a long time. You know, if you saw us marching back in 2014, it wasn't that we thought marching was cool. It was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014, and I never want to forget those things. So it's like my tattoo.
You say it was illegal to stand still because you refer to something in the book called the 5-second rule. What is the 5-second rule, or what was it?
If we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested, and that was the rule. You know, I was one of the plaintiffs in the court case that got that deemed unconstitutional, but it was a long 3 months of having to walk every time we were out in the street. I think the police thought that they were going to wear us out, but we were like, you know, we got to walk, you got to walk. And we did. We walked the whole time, and they had to walk, and I never want to forget how fragile freedom is.
So you thought you were going to stay in Ferguson for the weekend. Eventually you wound up staying there for about a year. Why did you decide that you needed to be present there? Actually, it was longer than a year.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I'm proud to say I was one of many people who stayed in the street. We were all out there for 400 days. It was the longest sustained protest on racial justice in the country's history. And I think we all realized that we were on the right side of justice, right? That like the police had killed Mike Brown. St. Louis has the highest rate of police violence in the country. And it was that awareness that then led us to think about what solutions look like. So we launched Campaign Zero, a platform around what solutions look like. We launched Mapping Police Violence. It's the most comprehensive database of police violence data in the country. And like we wanted wanted to figure out, like, how do we both bring attention to a crisis and then help people think about solutions?
You just alluded to mappingpoliceviolence.org because you tried to find out what the statistics were of police officers and killings. And what did you find when you tried to get that information?
Yeah, so, we can tell you the rainfall in Missouri in 1920 and can't tell you how many people the police killed last year. It's sort of wild that the federal government actually doesn't collect this data in any meaningful way. There are 18,000 police departments, no standardized way, no mandatory reporting. So if you get killed in this country and a newspaper doesn't write about you, you're just not in the data set, which is really wild. So we worked with other activists. There were activists who came before us who created 2 big databases, fatal encounters and killed by police. And then we worked to create one central repository that had all of the information in one place so people could really see. You probably are familiar with the Washington Post database. That's probably the most popular one. The challenge with the Post database is that it only includes on-duty killings that include a gun. So Botham Jean, who just got killed by the officer who walked in the middle of the night, she was off duty, she's not in the database. Eric Garner, who you surely know, he was killed by an officer on duty but didn't include a gun, so that's not in the database. And we felt like we needed to have one place with all the data, and we did it, and we still maintain it.
So what do your statistics show as far as the incidence of killings by police?
So a lot of interesting things. So one is that most people say that there's a relationship between community violence and police violence, that some communities are just so dangerous that police have to be there. And because the police are just overrepresented, obviously there might be some incidents, and the data actually doesn't support that there are a lot of places with high rates of community violence and almost no police violence and vice versa. Also, black people are more likely to be unarmed and not threatening in situations of police violence. So there's this idea that black people are just armed and dangerous in communities, and the data actually doesn't show that. So those are some of the things that we found. And then we launched a whole nother project around police union contracts and use of force policies. So Chicago actually is one of the places that the contract says that officers' disciplinary records are destroyed every 5 years. Cleveland, it says that they're destroyed every 2 years. We uncovered these things to help people start to realize there's structural reasons why the police are held accountable.
And so what structural changes would you recommend in terms of addressing the issue of police shootings or police killings?
So some of it is in the contract. So in Chicago, actually, there are people who filed a lawsuit to have a stay so the police couldn't destroy police officer records. That's one way to do it. There are places like California where the law literally says that any investigation that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline for an officer, regardless of the outcome. Those sort of things don't make sense. In Maryland, where I'm from, where I live, the law says that you can file an anonymous complaint against an officer for everything except brutality. And you're like, that just doesn't even make sense. So some of that is changing the laws. Some of it is changing the contracts.
You write that there is a double standard to protest in America. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think about when we were in the street in St. Louis and in cities across the country, we were armed with the truth and cell phones, and the police were extremely violent. You look at Charlottesville, the white supremacists, they had assault rifles. They literally pushed the police in droves. If we had done any of that, they would have shot us on sight. And I'm always mindful of the way that when black bodies stand in the street and say, this just isn't right, that the police just respond differently.
You also write that, this sentence jumped out at me, it is the work of white people to undo whiteness. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so white people, what is promising in this moment is that there are a lot of white people who understand white privilege for the first time. They're like, I benefit from things that I personally didn't work for. And that is the basic recognition of white privilege. The next step is having white people start to organize white people, is that it can't always be people of color organizing people of color, that white people to use their privilege to undo that privilege. So we see in the protests, white people standing on the front lines and putting their bodies at risk. We see other people creating space and using their platforms to amplify voices. All of that matters.
You met with President Obama several times, and as well as 2016 presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. What were those meetings about?
Yeah, so all of them were about solutions. So we think about with President Obama, we were pushing him to have the DOJ be more aggressive in holding police officers accountable. With Bernie, we met with him right after he released his first platform on racial justice. And Bernie sort of figured out the what the world could be. We were pushing him on the how. What does it mean? How will you attack jobs? What will you do around discrimination in police departments? And with Hillary, we were trying to get her plan to be as concrete as possible. And our last meeting with Hillary, we met with her when she became the nominee, and she was really thoughtful. I wish that they had, her team videotaped that interview or that conversation, and I wish that they would make that public. She was incredible.
If the opportunity arose, would you consider meeting with President Trump?
You know, there are few circumstances where I think a meeting would even be productive. It'd have to be in public if we met at all. He's not proven to be somebody who seems progressive on any of these issues, so I don't know how fruitful it would be. But if we did, it would have to be a public meeting so that he couldn't spin it some other way afterwards.
As you look back at your time at Ferguson, because it got so much, clearly it got so much attention nationally, is there something that happened on the ground, something that you learned or something you take away from that you think maybe the broader public doesn't completely comprehend?
It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book On the Other Side of Freedom. I wanted to think about like all the stories and experiences that I thought there were real lessons in. So in the book I read about there were so many people that you've never heard of, but without whom there would be no protests. And a reminder that most of the best organizing starts off really small. That the first thing I ever did in St. Louis was make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like it started small, a lot of imagination, a lot of ingenuity. And it's a reminder in the book, I hope is a reminder to people that you are enough to start a movement.
Part of the title of your book has to do with hope. What is the case for hope?
Yeah, you know, I think about when we say the system is broken and people say, oh no, it was designed to be like this. My takeaway is that it was designed, that people made this up, and because people made it up, we can make something better. So when I think about hope, hope is a belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays, and that is why you see people running for office. It's why you see people in the street. It's why you see people like you using your platform to talk about a range of stories, because we know that the world that it is today isn't the best version of the world. We can do something better.
DeRay McKesson, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Again, DeRay McKesson's book is called On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. And back with more right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
Summer's last gasp yesterday and the 30-degree temperature drop since then mean that it's time to start winding down the garden to get ready for winter. But there is still time to do a little more growing, believe it or not, and a lot more vegetable eating. Organic gardener Jean Nolan stopped by earlier today, and let's take a look. Okay, Jean, there is a nip in the air.
Yes.
But this bed still looks like it's being pretty darn productive. Tell me what's going on.
It's a generous bed. Well, to refresh memories, this is a bed where our goal was to plant a succession of crops, to be planting all season, which means about twice a month. And harvesting all season. So we have some crops in here that were planted in May, like our carrots that we'll be harvesting today, and others like our little radishes that were planted September 18th. And everything in between, we have about 12 crops in here.
And you mentioned some of the things are ready to come out now, and let's start with
our carrots.
All right.
So planted on May 17th, and they're looking good. Now these are rainbow carrots, so we have different colors. It looks like we predominantly got the orange and the yellow. Oh, we have some monsters, but they'll still be delicious. And so what we're going to do here is, as we've done here in past years, we're going to be bringing in our mini greenhouse, our cold frame.
Right.
So we can do one more planting within the next couple weeks in October of cold hardy crops that will thrive under the cold frame.
And those can be planted now?
They really can. And the best crop for that is spinach. And we're planting it from seed. But what's really an important component of succeeding in a bed like this has to do with the soil. You have to prepare the soil. It's really quite simple, but you really want to dig in and aerate the soil a bit.
You know, one of the things that continues to impress me is how you can be efficient with the use of the soil, and you can plant something cheek to jowl next to other crops, and it seems to do just fine.
Right, and it's intensive growing, which we can do because the soil is so nutrient rich. Part of how we do that is, this is a granulated fertilizer. It's certified organic, but because it is organic and naturally derived, you don't have to worry about burning your plants.
Got it.
Or really going overboard. You do want to mix it in nicely. And you know, the rain will do the rest, bringing it down. And then you just make your furrows. In this case, I'm going right along our drip tubing, 2 furrows. And we've got our spinach seed. And you know, I'm being a little generous with the soil. I'm sorry, with the seed.
Because you can always thin it out
okay.
later.
Yeah, and because it's under the cold frame, I don't mind if it's a little thick.
Got it. Got it.
And there we are. I mean, we'll cover it up
Just slightly, you don't compact it or
Not
anything
really,
very much?
it's just kind of like that. And there you go.
Gina, I've got to say, as I look at the colors of these peppers, they look spectacular. And what, the eggplant?
The
purple and the orange, it's very vivid. What are we going to do with this bed?
Right, well, these plants still think it might be summer, I don't know.
Poor things.
Tons of fruit on here. But anything ripe, which in this case, these are a yellow lunchbox pepper, means that they've turned yellow, we're going to pick. And you can see back here, they're really loaded. We've got a lot of them. And now is the time to eat them. You know, where we sit, early October, we could get a frost any day now.
What happens when the frost comes?
Bye-bye.
They're all just ruined.
I mean, they really don't like it in the 30s at all. So, two things. Now's the time to eat. Get out there, pick them, eat them. I'm saying it to myself too. And then as soon as we see on the weather that the temperatures are going to dip low, even though these haven't ripened up yet, they're still good for eating, and we'll pick them. And the same goes for all of the cold-sensitive crops in the garden. If you have cucumbers left, or zucchini, eggplant, tomatoes, basil.
Be forewarned, be alert.
Exactly, that frost is the end game. And I remember years at our garden in Lincoln Park Zoo picking gorgeous tomatoes on Halloween. So it can go. You know, we don't know when it's coming, but it's coming.
And for more on the WTTW Organic Garden, you can visit our website. Chicago artists and designers enrich the life of the city and make contributions well beyond its borders. Tomorrow night, WTTW launches a new 4-part series called Art and Design in Chicago. It's about the creative movements, people, and institutions of Chicago over the last 125 years. Here is an excerpt featuring legendary TV commercial director Joe Settlemeyer.
Are we recording? A commercial is something you watch when you sit down to watch something else. You should at least be entertained.
Everybody's missing.
I'm well aware of that fact, Eunice.
This thing about using Chicago people, they're human beings. Funny is funny. They called my people uglies. I mean, that's absurd. What are they seeing when they look in the mirror? These are regular people.
Isn't that right, Bingham?
You have no time to build character in 30 seconds. It has to be there. It might take me into the middle of the night to get a performance, but when I got it, it was choice stuff.
I'm putting you down to deal with Dallas. Don, is it a deal? Do we have a deal? It's a deal. I gotta go. I got a call coming in.
Joining us now is the producer and writer of the 4-part series Art and Design in Chicago, Dan Andrews. Dan produced the series Art Beat Chicago for many years and has made more than 20 documentaries here at Channel 11. Dan, congratulations on this new series. What is the goal of the series?
The goal is to get Chicagoans excited about the incredible creativity of the city, the breadth of the history, and the fact there's stuff you don't know. And it's cool to know.
And this series is part of a larger effort. What is that effort?
So the Tara Foundation and the Driehaus Foundation have this year-long initiative called Art Design Chicago, and it's like a real feast out there. You can go to symposiums, you can go to galleries, museums, and see these incredible exhibitions that really explore the history with new research, and we're part of that. So the series, there's a book, we just talked about that in Chicago Tonight, so the series is part of that initiative.
Well, let's get back to the series itself. There are so many artists and designers in the history of Chicago. This is a question that we always ask people who do a huge survey like this, but how do you pick the folks?
Well, you start about 2 years ago, you do incredible research, you have a panel of 8 advisors, and you know that there are stories you can't avoid. You have to touch on them. Sometimes it's about finding a new way into that story, and then of course you want to surprise people. So you always want to have a combination.
Well, tell us about one of the stories involving the Wall of Respect. What's the story behind that?
Oh my gosh, the Wall of Respect was this really extraordinary moment on the South Side at 43rd and Langley, where this group of artists called OBASI, the Organization of Black American Culture, got together, and in their visual art workshop, they took over the side of an apartment building, and they made this incredible mural, which was these panels, painted panels, photographs, poetry, that celebrated what they called black heroes: music, politics, statesmen, religious leaders, writers, etc. And it was really incredible. It was really from the community, and they did it collaboratively. These artists, not any single one claimed credit, although that's William Walker, and he was one of the lead people at OBASI, and he claims a lot of credit, but he wasn't alone.
A lot of characters march through this this epic march of creativity in Chicago. Dorothy and Otis Shepard, who were they?
They were a design duo, husband-wife design team, highly elegant, like movie star-like people who worked for P.K. Wrigley. And they branded the Doublemint twins, and they branded the Cubs. They did Cub programs. They did Cub logos. They brought the ivy to Wrigley Field, actually. So they were really.
Bill Veeck?
It was Dorothy and Otis and P.K. Wrigley in the 40s who did this, or maybe the early 50s. Someone's going to call up and tell me I'm wrong on the date. But there they are, and they were a really extraordinary design team.
You focus on a center called the Southside Community Arts Center, and let's take a clip of that.
The reason these walls are special is those people have touched these walls. They care for these walls. They rolled up their sleeves, they painted the floors, they washed the wood, they hung the artwork, and that's happened over 75 years.
Southside Community Arts Center unapologetically talks about the history and the accomplishments of the African American.
The works in the collection are people who were here and gave to the center.
This is one of my favorites of Charles White. It's titled A Closer Walk with Thee.
He was a genius.
He was a genius.
He was like in his teens.
Yeah.
One of the amazing things in my time here was the ability to have a person come into the center for the first time and to be able to pull out an Africover print and put it in front of them.
To be free, know thy past, prepare for the future.
Dan, you feature something called the Institute of Design. What was that?
The Institute of Design started actually as the new Bauhaus. This man named Laszlo Moholy Nagy, there's Nagy there,
Famous guy.
Yeah, he came to America, came to Chicago, and he started this school to educate people in the principles of design for the industrial age, for the moment we were in, and he hired these two guys, Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskin. Well, he actually hired Callahan, and Callahan hired Siskin to teach photography, and it totally transformed photography. They educated a generation of photographers in Chicago that came up with an entirely new way of looking at photography and a kind of modernism. Well, they really explored an idea to its fullest potential. They thought about the picture as a picture, and you can see examples there. And they really encouraged this exploration and this deeper dive. And there was always a certain kind of formal elegance to the work. But they looked at everyday life. They looked at ordinary existence as the source of high art. And they really did. That's a very Chicago thing, I think.
Surprises?
Oh, yeah, lots of surprises. I mean, I think finding Dorothy and Otis was a surprise. Certainly, digging into some of the history of other designers. Helen Hughes Delaney, she was a woman who had this incredible career out of nowhere and then disappeared after about 5 years. She's very rich, but she did these, in the 30s, during the Depression, did these beautiful objects that sold for a lot of money. And then we looked at the Hubbard Street Alternative Gallery scene, which was a really cool thing. That was in the 70s. So.
Dan Andrews, congratulations on the series. And this series is, as Dan mentioned, supported by the Terra Foundation in partnership with the Richard Driehaus Foundation. Art and Design in Chicago premieres tomorrow night at 8:30 right here on WTTW. And up next to the theater with Hetty Weiss.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
From light comedies to tragic dramas, the fall theater season is packed with something for everyone. Here to give us her views on some current highlights is Hetty Weiss. Hello, Hetty. And let's start off with Steppenwolf, because there's a production called Downstate at Steppenwolf, and you say it is fearless.
It is fearless, and it's harrowing, and it really makes you think. It is about sex offenders and what happens after they get out of prison, and they're put in a group home. There are 4 of them in this case. They're sharing an apartment in downstate Illinois. And here we see a scene in which they are meeting, as they do every week, with their parole officer. She's quite a tough
Well, you
character.
know what? Nobody really wants you all living anywhere, much less in their neighborhood. And I can't say as I altogether blame them.
Suggestion?
So maybe you ought to be thankful you got a roof over your head in the first.
Why not just put us on a desert island? Wouldn't that be? We strike such unspeakable terror in the hearts of the community.
Each of the 4 men have very different personalities, very different histories, very different crimes, but all sexual predators, and different ages. And so it's fascinating to watch them. But what happens is the real catalyst in the show is a guy who was abused by one of them and comes and wants a reckoning. And it doesn't tell you what to think, but it makes you think, because it says, you know, these people, one of them says, you know, maybe I should just be put on a desert island where, you know, not in my backyard. And you understand that, and especially, you know, if you have kids in the neighborhood, you understand that. But it's more complicated, and I think
did you get a sense of how the audience was reacting to these characters?
You know, I think it's the overall play. I think that they really started to ask themselves questions. I don't think he changed any minds, but he did make people think a little bit more deeply about what the whole problem is and how difficult any solution is.
Let's move on to Nell Gwynn at Chicago Shakespeare. Remind us, I think I've heard this name before. I had heard this name before, but who was Nell Gwynn?
Well, Nell Gwynn was an orange seller in the British theater in the 17th century, and she happened to be quite talented as an actress. She hung out at the theater, and she was discovered by a couple of people, and then she was discovered by King Charles II. And here in this scene, we see her. This is the first time that women sort of went on stage to play women. Usually it was men, and the male actor who usually played women's parts is not so happy.
They've disgraced our trade, ruined our art. They put a woman on stage.
So her mother was a madam in a brothel and an alcoholic, and she was, Nell Gwynn is just fantastically interesting and smart and a little bit bold, and she has this great love affair, and of course the king is kind of inept in lots of different ways, and it has a Me Too kind of you know, hip, modern quality to it. It has music in it. It's a play with music. It's from England, and it's just a lot of fun. It's kind of Shakespeare in love, but the next generation.
So you say she started out as an orange seller?
Right. She sold like what I guess we would call clementines these days, and that's what people ate in the theater rather than, you know, pretzels.
Well, it sounds like she had quite the career. Well, next is Caroline or Change. It's a musical with serious themes. What is it?
Well, it's quasi-autobiographical by Tony Kushner, who grew up not in New York, but in St. Charles, Louisiana. And it's about his relationship when he was a young boy, about 10. He calls himself Noah in the play. And his relationship with the black maid who has been working for a Jewish family for a long time, and who's kind of his surrogate mother. And we have a scene here where Noah asks why she's so angry all the time. This is 1962.
You're so sad, angry all the time. That ain't your business, it just ain't your business. You're a lovely child. How come you like me? I ain't never nice to you.
She has, it's a fascinating, the wonderful part of it, it's, the score is by Janine Tesori, and there's a sensational actress playing Carolyn, who just sings blues and pop, and she's undergoing change. There's an issue with just pocket change that she finds in the laundry, but more importantly than that, she is undergoing the change of civil rights, and she's not quite ready to let go because she's scared.
And you had some issues with the show.
You know, I did from the beginning. I saw it when it was first done on Broadway quite a while ago. And, you know, it's representing a Jewish family in this deep South where the idea of money, which is always a pernicious subject when you're talking about Jewish culture, and it's one family, and it seems to represent all families. And I found it a little cringeworthy.
I see. Well, let's move on.
But it's a brilliant production, I should say, and it's being
you're
done by...
encouraging people to see it.
Yeah, and it's being done by Firebrand, which bills itself as the world's first equity feminist musical theater.
All right. Well, this one has been described as a survival story, so tell us about We Are Only Alive for a Short Amount of Time.
Right. It's, I think it's a problematic title, but it is not a problematic show. It's David Cale, and I would say it's a one-man show, but even though he's the performer and the singer and the actor, and it's his biography, there are 6 musicians on stage in the back, and they're fabulous. And he is telling about the very dysfunctional family in which he grew up in a working class town in England. His father was an alcoholic. His mother was an artist who never really got to blossom. And in this clip, we see him trying to come to some terms with his father by taking him to a performance by Liza Minnelli, and it's a catastrophe.
Liza starts singing cabaret.
From behind me, I hear, "What good is sitting alone in your room? Come hear the music." And not quietly or discreetly. He's singing along at full volume. I hear this man screech, "Will you shut up?" And my dad yelled back, "If I want to bloody sing, I'll bloody sing."
Okay, so the other show that we should really mention is Tootsie, which has a fantastic performance by Santino Fontana, who is so believable as the kind of hunky guy and the woman.
And it's supposed to be headed to Broadway. Do you think it has legs to make it on Broadway?
Yeah, I think it needs a little bit of work, a little bit of trimming, a little bit of clarification, but his performance is just wonderful. Makes you forget Dustin Hoffman.
That's saying something.
Yes, it is.
Hetty Weiss, thank you as always.
Thanks, Phil.
And we are back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
And that is our show for this Thursday night. Stay connected by signing up for our daily briefing. And please join us tomorrow night at 7 for the Week in Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.